They broke the rules to break the code, and in doing so, reversed the tide of the entire Pacific War. Before we go deeper into how this decision changed the Pacific War forever, make sure to subscribe for more history that actually happened. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, a disheveled naval officer wearing a smoking jacket and slippers stood before Admiral Chester Nimitz in a basement at Pearl Harbor and made a prediction so precise it bordered on prophecy. Commander Joseph Rochefort told Nimitz that Japanese carriers would arrive northwest of Midway Island at bearing 325 degrees, approximately 175 miles out, at roughly 0600 hours on June 4, 1942. When his intelligence officer Edwin Layton finished briefing Nimitz on the findings from Station Hypo's code-breaking unit, the admiral simply asked how confident they were. Layton didn't hesitate. He said they'd stake everything on it. 3 days later, American dive bombers fell out of the clouds at almost the exact coordinates Rochefort had predicted, catching the Japanese fleet with its flight decks full of bombs and fuel lines. 4 Japanese carriers went to the bottom. The war's momentum shifted forever. What made this possible was not just cryptographic genius, but organizational defiance. Rochefort had bypassed the chain of command, ignored direct orders from Washington, and pursued a decryption method his superiors explicitly forbade. His punishment would come later. His victory came first. The physical space where this intelligence miracle occurred was as unglamorous as the work was vital. Station HYPO occupied the basement of the old administration building at Pearl Harbor, a concrete tomb designated by the Navy as the Fleet Radio Unit, Pacific. The codebreakers called it the dungeon. No windows penetrated the thick walls. Ventilation was poor, achieved through inadequate ducts that circulated stale air thick with cigarette smoke and the ozone smell of overheated electrical equipment. The temperature fluctuated wildly. In winter, the basement was cold and damp. In summer, it became an oven, the heat from IBM tabulating machines combining with Hawaii's tropical climate to create conditions barely tolerable for sustained mental work. Yet sustained mental work was precisely what the mission demanded. The basement was crammed with equipment. Rows of wooden tables held card indexes, thousands upon thousands of 5 by 8 inch cards, each representing a recovered code group or a suspected meaning. File cabinets lined the walls, bulging with intercepts, worksheets, and reference materials. The IBM machines occupied their own section, clattering day and night, punching holes in cards and sorting them at speeds that seemed miraculous in 1942 but which would seem glacial a generation later. The noise was constant. The machines clattered. Typewriters clicked. Officers and enlisted men called out code groups, cross-referencing findings, debating interpretations. There was no silence in the dungeon, no peace, only the relentless processing of information. Rochefort's team worked in rotating shifts around the clock. Some men worked 8 hours. Some worked 12. Some, including Rochefort himself, worked until they collapsed. Sleep came in snatches, on cots set up in corners of the basement or in adjacent rooms. Food was whatever could be brought in, sandwiches, coffee, occasionally hot meals from the base mess hall. The men ate at their desks, wolfing down food between calculations. There was no time for proper meals, no time for rest, not when the intercepted traffic piled up faster than it could be processed. The personnel at Station HYPO in early 1942 numbered roughly 120, a mix of officers and enlisted men. Not all were cryptanalysts. Many were radiomen, trained to operate the intercept equipment that captured Japanese transmissions from across the Pacific. Others were clerks and typists, transcribing the intercepted messages onto worksheets for analysis. The actual code-breaking team was smaller, perhaps 30 or 40 men with the mathematical and linguistic skills required for the work. Among them were some of the Navy's best, Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer, who had been working on Japanese code since the 1930s, Lieutenant Commander Wesley Wright, a mathematician with an intuitive grasp of patterns, and Jasper Holmes, a reservist and former submarine officer who brought operational knowledge to the analytical process. These men were not typical naval officers. Many wore civilian clothes in the basement. Discipline was informal. Rochefort cared nothing for military protocol and everything for results. He judged his men by their ability to break codes, not by their adherence to regulations. This created friction with visiting officers from Washington, who were scandalized by the casual atmosphere and Rochefort's smoking jacket, but it also created an environment where creativity thrived. The architecture of this moment began not in 1942 but in the silent decades before, when empires measured their strength in steel tonnage and signal intercepts. Japan's Imperial Navy had spent years perfecting its operational code system, known to American cryptanalysts as JN-25. The code consisted of approximately 27,500 five-digit numerical groups, each representing words, phrases, or military concepts. But the Japanese Navy did not stop there. After encoding a message into these numerical groups, operators would open a separate book containing thousands of random five-digit additives, which they would mathematically combine with the original code groups through non-carrying addition. This super-encipherment transformed even broken code groups into useless strings of numbers unless the cryptanalyst could strip away the additive layer first. The system changed regularly. Every few months, the Japanese Navy distributed new code books or additive tables to its ships and shore stations, resetting the cryptographic clock and forcing Allied codebreakers to begin again from zero. It was a fortress of numbers, built by mathematicians, protected by protocol, and considered by Tokyo to be unbreakable. The United States had been reading Japanese diplomatic communications for years through a system called Magic, which targeted the purple cipher machine used by the Foreign Ministry. But military codes, especially naval codes, remained a darker challenge. The Navy's cryptographic effort was scattered across the Pacific in 3 primary stations: Station Cast in the Philippines, later relocated to Melbourne after the fall of Corregidor; Station Negat in Washington, also known as OP-20OG, which functioned as the headquarters of Navy cryptanalysis; and Station HYPO at Pearl Harbor, a unit initially relegated to traffic analysis and lower priority work. Officially, HYPO reported to Washington. Unofficially, its commanding officer had other plans. Commander Joseph John Rochefort was not a typical naval officer. Born in 1900, he had joined the Navy during World War I and found his calling not in gunnery or navigation but in the strange borderland between mathematics, linguistics, and espionage. He studied Japanese language at the Navy School in Tokyo during the 1920s, immersing himself in the syntax, grammar, and cultural subtleties that would later allow him to read between the lines of intercepted messages. He cycled through assignments in cryptography and intelligence, developing a reputation as brilliant, stubborn, and utterly indifferent to military decorum. When he took command of Station HYPO in June 1941, 6 months before Pearl Harbor, he inherited a basement workspace beneath the old administration building at Pearl Harbor, a cramped and windowless space his team called the dungeon. It was humid, poorly ventilated, and filled with IBM tabulating machines that clattered day and night, processing punch cards loaded with intercepted code groups. Rochefort worked in a red smoking jacket and slippers, chain-smoking cigarettes while poring over worksheets covered in five-digit groups. He slept in a cot beside his desk. His staff worked rotating shifts around the clock, subsisting on coffee, sandwiches, and the shared obsession of cracking JN-25. By late 1941, Station HYPO had made only limited progress against the Japanese Naval Code. Traffic analysis, which involved studying the patterns, volumes, and call signs of radio transmissions, offered clues about ship movements and fleet organization, but the content of the messages remained opaque. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, did not come from a failure of code breaking alone, it stemmed from a confluence of intelligence gaps, bureaucratic fragmentation, and assumptions about Japanese intentions. But the attack galvanized the cryptanalytic effort. Suddenly, the volume of intercepted JN-25 traffic surged. Japanese ships moved across the Pacific in coordinated operations, generating the cryptographic depth that codebreakers needed. Depth meant multiple messages using the same additive sequences or repeating code groups, creating mathematical overlaps that revealed structure. Rochefort's team began stripping away the additive layer, one five-digit group at a time, cross-referencing intercepted messages against known phrases, geographic references, and operational patterns. By March 1942, Station HYPO was reading portions of JN-25B, the variant in use at the time. Not every message. Not every word. But enough. What they read in the spring of 1942 alarmed them. Japanese radio traffic indicated a major operation in preparation, larger than anything since Pearl Harbor. The messages used a two-letter designator that appeared repeatedly, AF. The code breakers deduced that AF was a target, a place the Japanese intended to strike with overwhelming force. But where was AF? Washington believed it referred to the Aleutian Islands or possibly the west coast of the United States. Some analysts thought it might be Oahu itself, a second strike at Pearl Harbor. Rochefort and his team at HYPO disagreed. Based on traffic patterns, ship call signs, and fragmentary references in partially decrypted messages, they concluded that AF was Midway Atoll, a tiny pair of islands roughly 1,300 miles northwest of Honolulu. Midway was strategically vital, a forward base for American patrol planes and a foothold in the Central Pacific. Its capture would extend Japan's defensive perimeter and potentially draw the remaining American carriers into a decisive battle. But Hypo's conclusion was not universally accepted. Washington dismissed it. Rochefort needed proof. In May 1942, he devised a plan that was as audacious as it was simple. If AF was Midway, then the Japanese would respond to information about Midway in their coded messages. Rochefort coordinated with Midway's garrison to send an uncoded radio transmission reporting that the island's desalination plant had broken down and fresh water was running low. The message went out in a cipher the Americans knew the Japanese had already broken. It was bait. Within 24 hours, HYPO intercepted a Japanese message, encoded in JN-25, reporting that AF was short of fresh water. The ruse confirmed it. AF was Midway. Rochefort now had the target, but he needed more. He needed the timing, the composition of the Japanese force, and the approach vector. His team worked without sleep, processing hundreds of intercepted messages, reconstructing the Japanese operational plan piece by piece. The picture that emerged was staggering. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, was committing nearly every capital ship at his disposal. For fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, veterans of the Pearl Harbor strike, would form the main striking force under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. Supporting them were battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and troop transports intended to invade and occupy Midway. It was the largest Japanese naval operation of the war. Yamamoto himself would sail aboard the super battleship Yamato, directing the battle from the rear. The plan was complex, relying on precise timing and the element of surprise. The Japanese assumed the Americans did not know. They were wrong. On May 27, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, Admiral Nimitz' fleet intelligence officer, stood in Nimitz's office and delivered Rochefort's findings. Layton told Nimitz that the Japanese would approach from the northwest, bearing 325 degrees, and launch their attack on the morning of June 4. He gave coordinates. He gave times. Nimitz listened without interruption. The intelligence was actionable, but it was also incomplete. Station HYPO could not break every message. Gaps remained. Washington continued to insist the attack would come elsewhere. Nimitz had to make a decision based on fragmentary intelligence from a basement unit in Hawaii that was openly defying headquarters. He chose to trust Rochefort. Nimitz ordered the immediate recall of Task Force 16, built around the carriers USS Enterprise and USS Hornet, which had just returned from the Doolittle raid on Tokyo. He also ordered emergency repairs to the carrier USS Yorktown, which had been damaged in the Battle of the Coral Sea in early May and was expected to need months in dry dock. The Navy's repair teams worked around the clock at Pearl Harbor, welding hull plates, patching flight decks, and restoring power systems. Yorktown left Pearl Harbor on May 30, seaworthy but not fully healed. Nimitz now had 3 carriers against Japan's 4. It was not parity, but it was a chance. He sent them northwest to wait in ambush. The Americans positioned their carriers northeast of Midway, beyond the range of Japanese reconnaissance planes, and waited. Rochefort's decrypts had not only revealed the target and the timing but also the Japanese order of battle. Nimitz knew which ships were coming, which commanders led them, and what routes they would take. It was the most complete pre-battle intelligence picture the United States had achieved in the Pacific War. But intelligence alone does not win battles. Execution does. On the morning of June 4, 1942, Japanese carriers launched their first wave against Midway's airfield, sending 108 aircraft, bombers, and fighters to suppress the island's defenses. American patrol planes from Midway spotted the Japanese fleet at 0552 hours, almost exactly when and where Layton had predicted. The report came in: enemy carriers bearing 320 degrees, distance 180 miles from Midway. The numbers matched Rochefort's projection with eerie precision. Nimitz's gamble had been correct. The Japanese fleet was steaming into an ambush. The Battle of Midway unfolded in a chaotic series of air strikes, missed opportunities, and moments of devastating precision. American torpedo bombers from all three carriers attacked first, flying low and slow in obsolete Douglas TBD Devastators. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, flying Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, tore them apart. Torpedo Squadron 8 from USS Hornet was annihilated, losing all 15 aircraft. Only one pilot, Ensign George Gay, survived, clinging to a seat cushion in the water while the battle raged above him. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise and Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown suffered similar losses. Of 41 torpedo bombers launched, 35 were shot down without scoring a single hit. It seemed like a massacre, a confirmation of Japanese air superiority. But the torpedo attacks, though costly, had drawn the Japanese Combat Air Patrol down to sea level, leaving the upper air undefended. At 1020 hours, dive bombers from Enterprise, flying Douglas SBD Dauntless aircraft, arrived over the Japanese fleet at 14,000 feet. They looked down and saw three carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Sarayu, their flight decks packed with aircraft being rearmed and refueled for a second strike. Bombs were stacked on the decks. Fuel lines were open. The carriers were defenseless. The dive bombers rolled over and plunged toward the targets. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led the strike from Enterprise, splitting his squadrons between Akagi and Kaga. At the same moment, bombers from Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, attacked Sarayu. The dives took less than a minute. Bombs fell from 14,000 feet to impact. 1,000-pound bombs struck Akagi amidships, penetrating the flight deck and detonating among the armed aircraft below. Secondary explosions ripped through the hangar deck. Fire consumed the ship. Kaga took multiple hits, 4 or 5 bombs in rapid succession, igniting fuel and ammunition. The carrier became an inferno. Sarayu was hit by 3 bombs, one of which detonated in the hangar deck and triggered a chain reaction among the aircraft and ordnance. Within minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were ablaze and doomed. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, had been operating separately and escaped the initial strike. At 1,100 hours, Hiryu launched a counterattack, sending dive bombers and torpedo planes against the American fleet. They found USS Yorktown and struck her with 3 bombs and 2 torpedoes. Yorktown, already damaged from Coral Sea and hastily repaired, absorbed the hits but was crippled. Her crew abandoned ship, though she remained afloat, drifting and listing. But Hiryu's strike had revealed her position. American dive bombers from Enterprise, redirected after the first strike, found Hiryu late in the afternoon. 4 bombs hit the carrier, setting her flight deck and hangar ablaze. By nightfall, all 4 Japanese carriers were burning or sinking. Akagi, Kaga, and Sarayu went down on June 4. Hiryu sank early on June 5. With them went more than 3,000 Japanese sailors and airmen, including many of the Navy's most experienced carrier pilots, irreplaceable veterans who had trained for years. The United States lost Yorktown, which was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine on June 6 while under tow and sank on June 7, and the destroyer USS Hamman. American casualties totaled 307 dead. Japanese casualties exceeded 3,000. But the real loss was strategic. Japan's carrier striking power, the instrument of its Pacific dominance, was shattered. Admiral Yamamoto, aboard Yamato hundreds of miles to the west, received the reports and realized the battle was lost. He ordered a general withdrawal. The invasion of Midway was cancelled. The Japanese fleet turned west and sailed for home. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japan had been stopped. For the first time, the United States had won a decisive fleet engagement. And it had happened because a codebreaker in a basement had refused to follow orders. The victory at Midway did not end the Pacific War. 3 more years of brutal combat lay ahead, island by island, across the central Pacific and into the Philippines, Okinawa, and the home islands of Japan. But Midway changed the trajectory. Before Midway, Japan advanced. After Midway, Japan defended. The balance of carrier power shifted permanently. The United States began producing new Essex-class carriers at a rate Japan could not match. Japanese shipyards, already stretched, could not replace the 4 fleet carriers lost in a single day. The experienced pilots, trained over years in the rigorous pre-war naval aviation program, were even harder to replace. Japan's carrier force never recovered. The war became attritional, and attrition favored the United States, with its vast industrial base and training infrastructure. Midway did not guarantee victory, but it made victory possible. Back at Pearl Harbor, Station HYPO continued its work, but the atmosphere darkened. Washington, embarrassed by Hypo's success and angered by Rochefort's insubordination, moved to assert control. The bureaucratic conflict between Station HYPO and OP-20G in Washington had simmered throughout the spring of 1942, fueled by professional jealousy, institutional rivalry, and personal animosity. Rochefort had bypassed Washington repeatedly, sending his intelligence assessments directly to Nimitz rather than through official channels. He had ignored directives from OP's 20G about priorities and methodologies. He had been proven spectacularly right, which made the insult worse. In October 1942, just 4 months after Midway, Rochefort was relieved of command and reassigned to lead a floating dry dock unit, a backwater post far from intelligence work. The official reason was rotation and rest. The real reason was retaliation. Washington wanted control of Pacific cryptanalysis, and Rochefort was an obstacle. His removal sent a message to the rest of the intelligence community. Competence without compliance would not be tolerated. Rochefort never commanded a code-breaking unit again. He spent the remainder of the war in obscure assignments, his contribution to Midway unrecognized in official citations. Many of his subordinates and superiors recommended him for the Distinguished Service Medal, the Navy's highest peacetime award. The recommendation was rejected. The officers who replaced him at HYPO, now reorganized under tighter Washington control, received commendations and promotions. Rochefort received nothing. He retired from the Navy in 1947 with the rank of captain, his wartime achievements largely forgotten outside a small circle of intelligence officers. He died in 1976, still waiting for recognition. 10 years later, in 1986, President Ronald Reagan posthumously awarded him the Distinguished Service Medal, acknowledging what the Navy had refused to acknowledge in life, that Rochefort's work had been indispensable to the American victory at Midway. The mechanics of how Station HYPO broke JN-25 reveal not just technical ingenuity but also intellectual persistence against a problem that resisted all conventional approaches. The Japanese naval code was not a cipher in the classical sense, where letters are systematically substituted or transposed. It was a code, meaning that entire words, phrases, and concepts were replaced by arbitrary numerical groups from a codebook. To break a code, cryptanalysts needed either the codebook itself, captured or reconstructed, or enough intercepted traffic to statistically deduce the meaning of individual code groups. But JN-25 added a second layer, superencipherment. After encoding a message into 5-digit groups, the Japanese operator would select a starting point in the additive book, a thick volume containing pages of random 5-digit numbers. The operator would then add each code group to the corresponding additive number, using non-carrying addition, a method where each digit is added independently without carrying over. For example, the the code group 123 for 5 plus the additive 67,890 would equal 79,235, because 1 plus 6 is equal to 7, 2 plus 7 is equal to 9, 3 plus 8 is equal to 1, mod 10, meaning the 1 is not carried, and so on. This additive transformed the code groups into gibberish unless the cryptanalyst could determine which additives had been used and strip them away. The starting point in the additive book changed with each message, identified by an indicator group transmitted at the beginning. Breaking a single message required identifying the indicator, recovering the additive sequence, subtracting it from the intercepted groups to reveal the underlying code groups, and then translating the code groups into plaintext. Each step was a separate puzzle. Station HYPO approached the problem systematically. They began by collecting vast quantities of intercepted messages, which radio intercept stations across the Pacific transmitted to Pearl Harbor for analysis. These messages were transcribed onto worksheets, long columns of 5-digit numbers, each column representing a separate message. The cryptanalysts then looked for patterns. If two messages used the same starting point in the additive book, they would share a portion of their additive sequence. By comparing the intercepted cipher groups from multiple messages, the team could identify overlaps, places where the same additives appeared. These overlaps allowed them to perform a technique called stripping, where the additives were mathematically isolated and removed, revealing the underlying code groups. Stripping required enormous amounts of traffic. In early 1942, the volume of Japanese naval communication surged as the Empire launched its offensive across the Pacific. The resulting traffic provided the depth station HYPO needed. By March 1942, they had recovered portions of the additive book and were beginning to reconstruct the codebook itself. They maintained vast card indexes, each card representing a recovered code group and its suspected meaning, cross-referenced with contextual clues from the messages. They used IBM tabulating machines to sort and process the data, a cutting-edge tool for the time. The machines could punch and sort thousands of cards per hour, allowing the team to test hypotheses and correlations far faster than manual calculation. Rochefort described the work as part science, part intuition. Sometimes a single word, guessed correctly, would unlock an entire message. The AF water ruse in May 1942 exemplified this blend of method and creativity. Rochefort's team suspected AF meant Midway based on traffic analysis, call signs, and the operational context of the messages. But suspicion was not proof. The team needed confirmation solid enough to convince Admiral Nimitz to commit his outnumbered carriers to a specific location on a specific date. The fake water shortage message exploited the fact that the Japanese had broken some American codes, a vulnerability that could be turned into an asset. By broadcasting an uncoded message about Midway's water problem, Rochefort ensured the Japanese would intercept it, encode a report about it in JN-25, and transmit that report to their own commanders. When HYPO intercepted the resulting Japanese message and read AF short of water, the loop closed. The ruse proved not only that AF was Midway but also that HYPO could read enough of JN-25 to extract operationally relevant intelligence. This single intercept gave Nimitz the confidence to act. Yet even at Midway, station HYPO did not break every message or every code group. Their read rate on JN-25B in May 1942 was partial, perhaps 10 to 15% of the groups in any given message. But that was enough. Cryptanalysis does not require perfect decryption. It requires enough decryption to extract the critical facts, the target, the timing, the composition of forces. Rochefort's team extracted those facts, and Nimitz used them. The technical achievement was matched by an organizational one. Rochefort bypassed the bureaucratic impediments, ignored Washington's competing assessments, and delivered his intelligence directly to the officer who could act on it. In doing so, he violated the chain of command and ensured his own professional destruction. But he also saved Midway. The strategic consequences of the Battle of Midway rippled outward across the Pacific and shaped the remainder of the war. Japan's loss of 4 fleet carriers in a single engagement fundamentally altered the naval balance. Before Midway, Japan possessed 10 fleet carriers, a force built over 2 decades of naval expansion and technological development. The United States, after the losses at Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea, had only 3 operational carriers in the Pacific in June 1942. After Midway, Japan had 6 carriers, and the United States, despite losing Yorktown, retained 2, with new construction rapidly coming online. But the numbers alone do not capture the full impact. Japan's pre-war carrier force was built on a foundation of highly trained, combat-experienced pilots, men who had spent years mastering carrier aviation, a discipline requiring precision, coordination, and nerve. The pilots lost at Midway, along with the ground crews, maintenance personnel, and ship's officers, represented an investment in human capital that could not be replaced. Japan's pilot training program, rigorous and selective, could not scale to meet wartime attrition. The United States, by contrast, expanded its training infrastructure massively, producing thousands of aviators by 1943 and 1944. The qualitative advantage shifted. Equally important was the shift in strategic initiative. Before Midway, Japan was expanding. After Midway, Japan was consolidating. The planned invasion of Midway was part of a broader strategy to extend the defensive perimeter eastward, threatening Hawaii and forcing the United States into a negotiated settlement. The failure at Midway ended that strategy. Japan would launch no more major offensives in the Central Pacific. Instead, it would fight a defensive war, attempting to hold the vast empire it had conquered in the first 6 months of the conflict. The United States, meanwhile, began planning offensive operations. In August 1942, just 2 months after Midway, American forces landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, initiating a 6-month campaign that bled both sides but ultimately established American control of the Southern Pacific. The momentum, once Japan's, now belonged to the Allies. Midway made Guadalcanal possible. Guadalcanal made the advance through the Central Pacific possible. The chain of causation ran directly from the Codebreaker's basement at Pearl Harbor to the beaches of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and the Midway operation, recognized the disaster immediately. He had gambled on achieving a decisive victory that would cripple American morale and force a negotiated peace. Instead, he had lost the core of his carrier fleet in a single day. The Japanese public was not informed. The government censored news of the defeat, reporting only minor losses and claiming a tactical success. Even within the Navy, the full scale of the disaster was concealed. Officers were transferred to isolated posts to prevent the truth from spreading. But Yamamoto knew. He spent the next year attempting to rebuild Japan's carrier aviation capability, but the resources were insufficient, the time too short. In April 1943, American codebreakers once again intercepted Japanese communications, this time revealing Yamamoto's travel itinerary for an inspection tour of the Solomon Islands. Admiral Nimitz, informed of the intercept, authorized an ambush. On April 18, 1943, American P-38 Lightning fighters intercepted Yamamoto's transport plane over Bougainville and shot it down, killing the admiral. The operation, code-named Vengeance, was another intelligence-driven success, directly descended from the methods pioneered by Rochefort and Station HYPO. Yamamoto's death deprived Japan of its most capable naval strategist at a moment when strategic leadership was desperately needed. The war continued, grinding toward its inevitable conclusion, but Japan's chances, already slim after Midway, evaporated entirely. The legacy of Station HYPO and the Midway code breaking extends beyond the immediate tactical victory and touches on fundamental questions about the role of intelligence in modern warfare. Midway demonstrated that information, properly used, could compensate for material disadvantage. Nimitz's 3 carriers were outnumbered, but they were forewarned. Knowledge of the enemy's plan allowed the Americans to position their forces for maximum effect, to strike first, and to exploit Japanese vulnerabilities. The principle, simple in theory, was revolutionary in practice. Intelligence had always been valuable, but Midway proved it could be decisive. The lesson was not lost on the United States military. Investment in signals intelligence, cryptanalysis, and electronic warfare expanded throughout the war. By 1945, the United States was reading Japanese military and diplomatic traffic across multiple code systems, providing Allied commanders with a comprehensive view of enemy intentions. The infrastructure built during the war became the foundation for Cold War intelligence organizations, including the National Security Agency, which traces its lineage directly to the Navy's wartime cryptanalytic units. But the story also carries a darker lesson about institutional behavior and the treatment of those who challenge authority. Rochefort's removal from Station HYPO was not an aberration, it was policy. Washington valued control more than results, hierarchy more than effectiveness. The officers who punished Rochefort were not ignorant of his achievement. They were threatened by it. His success outside official channels undermined their authority and exposed the inadequacies of centralized command. The response was predictable: reassert control, remove the disruptor, ensure compliance. Rochefort's fate sent a clear message to other intelligence officers: produce results, but do not embarrass headquarters. Do not bypass the chain of command. Do not make the wrong people look incompetent. The price of independent judgment, even when correct, was professional exile. It took 40 years for the institution to acknowledge its error. By then, Rochefort was dead. The dive bomber attack that decided the Battle of Midway lasted less than 5 minutes but was the culmination of hours of confusion, missed connections, and desperate searches across hundreds of miles of empty ocean. The American carrier task forces, positioned northeast of Midway based on Rochefort's intelligence, launched their strikes early on the morning of June 4, 1942. The timing was calculated to catch the Japanese carriers while they were recovering and rearming aircraft from the first strike on Midway Island. But coordination between the American carriers was poor. Enterprise and Hornet launched their strikes separately, and Yorktown launched later still. The squadrons, flying at different altitudes and speeds, became separated. The torpedo bombers, flying slow and low in the obsolete TBD Devastator, arrived first. They had no fighter escort. The Wildcat fighters assigned to protect them had been launched at different times or had become separated during the flight. The torpedo bombers pressed their attacks alone. Torpedo Squadron 8 from USS Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, sighted the Japanese fleet at approximately 0918 hours. Waldron did not wait for the dive bombers or fighters. He led his 15 aircraft directly toward the enemy carriers. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, flying Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters, fell on them immediately. The Zeros were faster, more maneuverable, and flown by experienced pilots. The TBD Devastators, loaded with torpedoes and flying at wave-top altitude to launch, were defenseless. One by one, the Devastators were shot down. Some exploded in midair. Some crashed into the sea trailing smoke and flame. A few managed to launch their torpedoes before being hit, but the torpedoes, slow and unreliable, were easily avoided by the maneuvering Japanese carriers. Within 10 minutes, all 15 aircraft of Torpedo Squadron 8 were destroyed. Only one pilot, Ensign George Gay, survived. His aircraft was hit and crashed into the ocean. He floated in the water, hidden under a seat cushion, and watched the rest of the battle unfold around him. He was rescued the next day. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise attacked at 0940 hours and suffered similar losses. Of 14 aircraft launched, 10 were shot down without scoring a hit. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown attacked at 1000 hours and lost 10 out of 12 aircraft. The torpedo attacks had been slaughters, costly and seemingly futile. But the torpedo attacks had forced the Japanese Combat Air Patrol down to sea level. The Zeros, focused on destroying the slow-moving torpedo bombers, were out of position when the American dive bombers arrived at high altitude. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the dive bombers from Enterprise, had been searching for the Japanese fleet for over an hour. His squadrons, Bombing Squadron 6 and Scouting Squadron 6, had flown to the expected intercept point and found empty ocean. McCluskey made a decision that saved the battle. Instead of returning to Enterprise, he extended his search, following a hunch on a Japanese destroyer he spotted racing northward. The destroyer, part of the screening force for the carrier group, led McCluskey directly to the target. At 1020 hours, he looked down from 14,000 feet and saw 3 Japanese carriers in formation below: Akagi, Kaga, and Sarayu. Their flight decks were crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled. Bombs and torpedoes were stacked on the decks. Fuel lines were connected to the aircraft, pumping volatile aviation gasoline into their tanks. The carriers were at their most vulnerable. McCluskey split his force. One squadron dove on Kaga. The other dove on Akagi. At almost the same moment, dive bombers from Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, arrived over the fleet and dove on Sarayu. The Japanese carriers had seconds to react. Lookouts shouted warnings. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire. The Zeros, still at sea level after engaging the torpedo bombers, climbed desperately to intercept. But they were too late. The Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers, screaming down from 14,000 feet at speeds exceeding 250 miles per hour, were nearly impossible to hit. Each pilot focused on his target, ignoring the flak bursting around him, adjusting his dive angle, waiting for the precise moment to release. The bombs fell free at approximately 2,000 feet altitude. The pilots pulled out of their dives, subjecting themselves to crushing G-forces, and leveled off just above the waves. Behind them, the bombs struck. The first bomb to hit Akagi struck near the midship elevator, penetrating the flight deck and detonating in the upper hangar. The explosion ignited fuel from ruptured aircraft and triggered secondary explosions among the bombs and torpedoes stacked on the hangar deck. Fire spread instantly. Within minutes, Akagi was an inferno. Her captain tried to maintain control, but the fires could not be contained. The ship's steering jammed, sending her into an uncontrolled turn. Damage control parties fought the flames, but the heat was too intense. Ammunition began cooking off. Explosions ripped through the ship. Admiral Nagumo, commanding the carrier strike force, transferred his flag to a cruiser. At 19:15 hours, after all efforts to save the ship had failed, the order was given to abandon Akagi. Japanese destroyers moved alongside to take off survivors. Early on June 5, Japanese torpedoes scuttled the burning wreck. Akagi, flagship of the Pearl Harbor Strike Force, sank into the Pacific. Kaga took multiple hits. 4 or 5 bombs struck the carrier in rapid succession, hitting the flight deck, hangar deck, and superstructure. The damage was catastrophic. Fuel and ammunition ignited. The forward magazines detonated, blowing the bow apart. Fires consumed the ship. Kaga's crew fought to save her, but the ship was doomed. By 1640 hours, the order came to abandon ship. Kaga sank at 1925 hours, taking 800 men with her. Sarayu was struck by 3 bombs, all hitting within minutes. One bomb detonated among armed and fueled aircraft on the hangar deck, creating a firestorm that consumed the ship. Sarayu's crew abandoned her at 1045 hours. She remained afloat, burning, until 1915 hours, when she rolled over and sank. In less than 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's fleet carriers had been fatally damaged. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, operating separately from the main group, escaped the initial strike. At 1100 hours, Hiryu launched a counterattack, sending dive bombers and torpedo planes against the American fleet. They found Yorktown and struck her with 3 bombs and 2 torpedoes. Yorktown, already damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea, absorbed the punishment but was crippled. Her crew abandoned ship, though she remained afloat. But Hiryu's attack revealed her position. At 1700 hours, dive bombers from Enterprise, redirected after the first strike, found Hiryu and dove on her. 4 bombs hit, smashing her flight deck and igniting fires below. Hiryu burned through the night. Her captain and Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commanding the carrier division, chose to go down with the ship. Hiryu sank early on June 5. By then, all 4 Japanese carriers were gone. The men and women who worked at Station HYPO during those frantic months in 1942 did not receive parades or public recognition. Their work was classified for decades. Many of them never told their families what they had done during the war. They worked in a windowless basement, processing endless columns of 5-digit numbers, looking for patterns in noise, translating fragments into meaning. They worked without sleep, sustained by coffee and the belief that their work mattered. They were right. The intelligence they produced allowed Admiral Nimitz to position 3 American carriers northeast of Midway on the morning of June 4, 1942, in exactly the right place to ambush the Japanese fleet. The bombers that fell from the sky at 1020 hours and destroyed 4 carriers in 5 minutes could not have done so without the codebreakers who told them where to go. The victory at Midway was a victory of pilots, sailors, and air crews, men who flew obsolete aircraft into overwhelming defenses and died by the dozens to open a window for the strike. But it was also a victory of mathematicians, linguists, and cryptanalysts who broke a code the enemy believed was unbreakable and who did so in defiance of their own headquarters. The technical details of JN25, the 5-digit code groups and non-carrying additives, have become artifacts of history, museum pieces in the evolution of cryptography. Modern encryption relies on computational complexity, algorithms designed to resist attack even with unlimited processing power. The methods used at station HYPO, pencil and paper, card indexes, and electromechanical tabulators seem primitive by comparison. But the principles endure. Cryptanalysis remains a discipline of pattern recognition, statistical inference, and intellectual persistence. The codebreakers at HYPO succeeded not because they had better tools than the Japanese, but because they had better minds and because they were willing to work harder, longer, and more creatively than their adversaries. They succeeded because Joseph Rochefort, a chain-smoking officer in a bathrobe, refused to accept Washington's assessments and refused to let bureaucracy interfere with the mission. His defiance cost him his career. It also won the battle that turned the war. When historians evaluate the turning points of the Pacific War, they often emphasize material factors: the industrial capacity of the United States, the logistical reach of the Navy, the courage of the Marines on island beaches. These factors mattered. But Midway was not won by industry or logistics or courage alone. It was won by intelligence. It was won by knowing where the enemy would be when he would arrive, and how to hit him hardest. That knowledge came from a basement at Pearl Harbor, from a team working under pressure and without recognition, and from a commander willing to risk everything on the accuracy of partially decrypted messages. The risk paid off. The gamble succeeded. And the tide of the Pacific War, which had been flowing west toward Hawaii and the American coast, reversed and began flowing west toward Tokyo. The irony is this: the side that planned Midway lost. The side that reacted won. Admiral Yamamoto's operation was a masterpiece of naval planning, a complex, multi-stage offensive designed to lure the American carriers into a trap and destroy them. It was based on detailed intelligence about American strength, careful coordination of multiple task forces, and the assumption that surprise would be complete. The plan failed not because it was poorly conceived but because the Americans knew it was coming. They knew because they had broken the code. And they broke the code because a handful of men and women in a basement refused to give up on a problem that seemed impossible. Rochefort later said that breaking JN25 was not a matter of inspiration or brilliance, but simply hard work. He said his team succeeded because they worked longer hours and tried more approaches than anyone else. He was being modest. Persistence alone does not break codes. Persistence combined with insight, creativity, and the ability to see patterns in chaos breaks codes. Station HYPO had all three. The physical space where this happened no longer exists. The basement of the old administration building at Pearl Harbor was repurposed after the war. The IBM tabulators were decommissioned. The card indexes were destroyed or archived. The men and women who worked there scattered to civilian life or other assignments. Rochefort himself faded into obscurity, taking with him the details of methods and struggles that would have filled volumes. Some of those details were declassified decades later. Some remain classified even now. But the outcome is clear. On June 4, 1942, the United States won the most decisive naval engagement of the Pacific War because its codebreakers told its commanders where to send the bombers. The bombers did the rest. Midway did not end the war. It did not guarantee victory, but it made victory imaginable. Before Midway, the question was whether the United States could stop Japan. After Midway, the question was how long it would take to defeat Japan. The answer was 3 more years, 3 years of blood and fire, from Tarawa to Saipan, from Peleliu to Okinawa, island by island, mile by mile. But the trajectory was set at Midway. The balance tipped at Midway. And the man who tipped it wore a bathrobe and worked in a basement and paid for his success with the rest of his career. The institution that punished him eventually, grudgingly, admitted its error. By then, it was too late for Rochefort. But it was not too late for history to remember what he and his team accomplished. The mathematics of code-breaking JN25 involved layers of complexity that defeated casual attempts at solution. The additive system was designed specifically to resist statistical attack. In a simple substitution cipher, frequency analysis can reveal patterns. The letter E appears most often in English, so the most common symbol likely represents E. But JN25 was not a substitution cipher. It was a code combined with an additive layer that destroyed frequency patterns. Each 5-digit code group could represent a word, a phrase, or a concept. The code groups themselves were not sequential or logical. The number 12,345 might mean battleship, while 12346 might mean weather. There was no relationship between adjacent numbers. This meant that recovering one code group provided no information about adjacent groups. Each had to be solved independently or through context. The additive layer made this exponentially harder. After encoding a message into code groups, the Japanese operator would open the additive book and select a starting point, indicated by a key included in the message header. From that starting point, the operator would add each successive additive to each successive code group using non-carrying addition. This transformed the code groups into cipher groups that had no relationship to the underlying code. To break a message, station HYPO had to first identify the starting point in the additive book, then recover the specific additive values used, then subtract them from the cipher groups to reveal the code groups, and finally translate the code groups into Japanese and then into English. Each step required insight, calculation, and vast amounts of data. The breakthrough technique that station HYPO developed was called depth analysis, a method that exploited the fact that additive sequences repeated across multiple messages. If 2 messages used the same starting point in the additive book, they would share portions of their additive sequence. By comparing the cipher groups from these 2 messages, the cryptanalysts could mathematically isolate the additives without knowing their actual values. This was possible because the additives added the same value to different code groups. If cipher group A was code group X plus additive Y, and cipher group B was code group Z plus the same additive Y, then subtracting cipher group A from cipher group B would eliminate the additive and reveal the relationship between code groups X and Z. This relationship, combined with contextual knowledge about message content, allowed the team to recover both the additives and the code groups. The process required enormous computational effort. Each comparison generated hypotheses that had to be tested against other messages, other code groups, and operational context. The IBM tabulating machines accelerated this process by sorting and comparing thousands of card entries per hour, but the machines could not think. They could only process data according to instructions programmed by the analysts. The real work was done by men like Dyer and Wright, who sat at tables covered with worksheets, manually comparing 5-digit numbers, looking for patterns, testing hypotheses, and slowly, painstakingly, reconstructing the Japanese codebook one entry at a time. By May 1942, station HYPO had recovered perhaps 3,000 to 4,000 code groups out of the 27,500 in the complete JN25B codebook. This represented a partial read capability of roughly 10 to 15%. In cryptanalysis, partial reads are often sufficient. A message does not need to be completely decrypted to yield actionable intelligence. If the analysts could read enough code groups to extract the target, the timing, and the composition of forces, they had everything Nimitz needed to make decisions. The challenge was identifying which messages contained critical information and prioritizing those for intensive analysis. Traffic analysis helped. By studying the volume, timing, and call signs of transmissions, Station HYPO could identify which Japanese units were active, where they were located, and what level of operational tempo they maintained. A surge in traffic from a particular fleet indicated preparation for action. Changes in call sign patterns suggested reorganization or movement. These clues guided the cryptanalysts toward the most promising messages, the ones most likely to contain operational intelligence. The question that haunts this story is not whether Station Hypo's work was valuable, clearly it was, but whether the institutional behavior that punished Rochefort was an anomaly or a feature. Was his removal an isolated mistake, a product of personal animosities and wartime confusion, or was it the predictable result of an organization that valued hierarchy over results? The evidence suggests the latter. The conflict between Station HYPO and OP-20G in Washington was not personal, it was structural. Washington wanted centralized control of cryptanalysis. Rochefort wanted operational autonomy. Washington wanted reports filtered through official channels. Rochefort wanted to deliver intelligence directly to the commander who could act on it. Washington wanted credit. Rochefort wanted results. These conflicts were irreconcilable. Someone had to lose. Rochefort lost. But so did Washington, because the removal of Rochefort from cryptanalysis deprived the Navy of one of its most capable intelligence officers at a time when such officers were desperately needed. The Navy won the war despite this decision, not because of it. The ultimate irony is that Midway vindicated Rochefort's methods completely. He had bypassed Washington. He had ignored orders. He had pursued a decryption approach that headquarters considered wasteful. And he had been exactly right. The Japanese attacked Midway on June 4, 1942, from the northwest, at bearing 325 degrees, 175 miles out, at 0600 hours, precisely as he had predicted. No intelligence officer in the history of warfare had ever delivered a more accurate operational forecast. And his reward was removal from the field he had mastered. The lesson, for those who cared to learn it, was clear: the institution does not reward brilliance. It rewards compliance. Brilliance that comes with compliance is valued. Brilliance that comes with defiance is punished. Rochefort chose defiance. He made that choice consciously, knowing the likely consequences. He did it because he believed the mission was more important than his career. He was right about that too. When the war ended in August 1945, the full scope of the Allied cryptanalytic success began to emerge. The United States and Britain had broken virtually every major code and cipher system used by Germany and Japan. Ultra, the British code-breaking operation against German Enigma machines, had provided the Allies with a continuous stream of high-grade intelligence throughout the European war. Magic, the American effort against Japanese diplomatic codes, had given policymakers insight into Tokyo's strategic thinking. And JNA-25, the Japanese naval code broken by stations like HYPO, had provided operational intelligence that shaped every major naval engagement in the Pacific. The cumulative impact was immense. Historians have estimated that code breaking shortened the war by months, possibly years, saving countless lives on both sides. The exact contribution is impossible to quantify, but the direction is clear. Intelligence mattered. Cryptanalysis mattered. Station HYPO mattered. And Joseph Rochefort, the disheveled officer in the smoking jacket, mattered more than anyone acknowledged at the time. The human cost of breaking JN-25 extended beyond the cryptanalysts themselves to the radiomen who captured the raw intercepts. These sailors, stationed at remote listening posts across the Pacific, sat for hours wearing headphones, transcribing Japanese Morse code transmissions. The work required intense concentration. A single missed digit could render a message useless. The radiomen worked in shifts, monitoring assigned frequencies, logging every transmission, no matter how routine or fragmentary. The intercepts were then transmitted to Pearl Harbor for analysis, either by radio or, when security permitted, by courier. The volume of traffic was staggering. Hundreds of messages arrived daily. Most contained routine administrative content, weather reports, supply requests, personnel transfers. but hidden among the routine traffic were the operational messages, the orders, and reports that revealed Japanese intentions. Identifying which messages mattered required judgment and context that only the cryptanalysts possessed. This meant that every intercept, no matter how mundane it appeared, had to be logged, transcribed, and forwarded to station HYPO. The radiomen could not know which transmission would prove critical until after the codebreakers analyzed it. The pressure on Rochefort and his team intensified as the intelligence picture of the impending Japanese operation crystallized in late May 1942. They knew a major attack was coming. They knew it was aimed at AF, which they had confirmed was Midway. But they did not know everything. Gaps remained in their understanding of the Japanese plan. Some messages could not be decrypted. Some code groups remained unrecovered. Washington's skepticism added another layer of stress. OP-20G continued to insist that the attack would target the Aleutians or the West Coast. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations in Washington, questioned whether Midway intelligence was reliable enough to base operational decisions on. Rochefort had staked his professional reputation on his assessment. If he was wrong, if the Japanese struck somewhere else, the consequences would be catastrophic. The Pacific Fleet would be out of position. Midway would fall. The Hawaiian Islands would be threatened. And Rochefort would be blamed. The weight of this responsibility was immense. He later said that the weeks leading up to the battle were the most stressful of his life. Every intercepted message had to be analyzed. Every code group had to be tested against the hypothesis. Every piece of evidence had to be weighed. Sleep became a luxury he could not afford. He napped at his desk, woke to new intercepts, and resumed work. His staff followed his example. The dungeon operated at maximum intensity, 24 hours a day, processing information, refining estimates, feeding intelligence to Nimitz. Admiral Nimitz, for his part, faced his own pressures. He commanded a fleet that was outnumbered and still recovering from the Pearl Harbor attack 6 months earlier. His carrier force consisted of 3 ships, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. The Japanese were committing for fleet carriers, all veterans of the Pearl Harbor operation, plus battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. On paper, the odds favored Japan. Nimitz's advantage, his only advantage, was intelligence. If Rochefort was right, Nimitz could position his carriers for an ambush. If Rochefort was wrong, Nimitz would lose his fleet. The decision was binary. Trust the codebreakers or ignore them. Nimitz chose to trust them. He later said that Rochefort's confidence, his absolute certainty about the target and timing, convinced him. Nimitz had met with Leighton and Rochefort personally. He had reviewed the decrypts. He had questioned the analysis. And he had concluded that the intelligence was sound. On May 28, 1942, Nimitz issued orders. Enterprise and Hornet, freshly returned from the Doolittle raid, would depart immediately for a position northeast of Midway designated Point Luck. Yorktown, under emergency repair at Pearl Harbor, would follow as soon as she was seaworthy. The carriers would wait in ambush, hidden beyond the range of Japanese search planes, and strike when the enemy fleet appeared. It was a calculated risk, the kind of decision that defines command. Nimitz took that risk because Rochefort gave him the intelligence to justify it. The personal toll on Rochefort extended beyond stress and exhaustion. The bureaucratic warfare with Washington escalated throughout the spring of 1942. The conflict was partly about credit, partly about methodology, and partly about control. OP-20G wanted all intelligence to flow through Washington, where it could be vetted, coordinated, and disseminated through official channels. Rochefort wanted to deliver intelligence directly to Nimitz, cutting out the bureaucratic delays. Speed mattered in operational intelligence. A message decrypted today and delivered today could shape tomorrow's decisions. A message decrypted today and delivered next week, after routing through Washington, was useless. Rochefort understood this. Washington did not, or did not care. The conflict came to a head when Rochefort confirmed that AF was Midway using the water shortage ruse. Washington had not authorized the ruse. Rochefort had coordinated it directly with Midway and executed it without informing his superiors. When Washington learned of it, the reaction was fury. Rochefort had exceeded his authority. He had conducted an active deception operation without clearance. The fact that the operation succeeded, that it confirmed the target and enabled the victory at Midway, did not matter to the officers in Washington. What mattered was that Rochefort had defied the chain of command. The wheels of retribution began turning immediately. Within weeks of Midway, memos circulated in Washington recommending Rochefort's removal. The official reason would be rotation and rest. The real reason was punishment. Today, Midway is remembered primarily as a battle, a clash of carriers, a victory of dive bombers over Japanese flight decks. The battle is dramatic, cinematic, filled with moments of heroism and tragedy. Torpedo bombers flying into walls of fire. Pilots nursing damaged planes back to carriers. Sailors abandoning burning ships. These images dominate the memory of Midway. But beneath the drama lies the quieter, less visible story of the basement at Pearl Harbor, the codebreakers processing 5-digit numbers in the dark, the IBM machines clattering through the night, the analysts cross-referencing fragments of intercepted messages and building a picture of Japanese intentions one code group at a time. This story is less cinematic. It involves no explosions, no dogfights, no burning carriers. But it is no less crucial. Without Station HYPO, there would have been no ambush. Without Rochefort, there would have been no intelligence. Without the intelligence, Midway would have been a trap for the Americans, not the Japanese. The outcome of the battle, and perhaps the war, would have been different. The men and women who worked at Station HYPO understood this. They did not need recognition or awards. They knew what they had done. They knew their work had mattered. For them, that was enough. But history requires more than the satisfaction of the participants. History requires acknowledgement, documentation, and understanding. For decades, the story of Station HYPO was locked behind classification barriers. Only in the 1980s and 1990s, as documents were declassified and veterans began to speak, did the full picture emerge. Joseph Rochefort's contribution, denied during his lifetime, was finally recognized. The Distinguished Service Medal, awarded posthumously in 1986, was a small gesture, insufficient compensation for a career destroyed, but it was acknowledgement. The institution, slow and grudging, admitted that it had been wrong. That admission, late as it was, mattered. The broader lesson of Midway and Station HYPO is about the value of decentralized intelligence, the importance of trusting officers in the field, and the dangers of bureaucratic overreach. Rochefort succeeded because he was close to the problem, close to the intercepted traffic, close to the operational commanders who needed the intelligence. He understood the context in a way that analysts in Washington could not. He had the flexibility to experiment, to pursue unconventional approaches, to make decisions quickly without waiting for approval. Washington, distant and hierarchical, lacked that flexibility. The conflict between HYPO and OP-20G was not just personal or political, it was epistemological. It was a conflict about how intelligence should be produced, who should control it, and whose judgment should prevail. Rochefort believed that intelligence officers in the field, with access to the raw data and the operational context, were best positioned to make assessments. Washington believed that centralized control ensured consistency and prevented rogue analysis. Both views had merit. But at Midway, Rochefort's view was vindicated. Decentralized intelligence, produced by officers close to the front and delivered directly to commanders, won the battle. Centralized control would have lost it. This tension persists in military and intelligence organizations to this day. The question of how much autonomy to grant field units, how much control to centralize, and how to balance creativity with consistency remains unresolved. Midway offers no universal answer. It offers only an example, a case where autonomy succeeded, where defiance was justified, and where the institution's instinct to punish that defiance was wrong. Whether the lesson was learned is another question. When the last Japanese carrier slipped beneath the waves on the morning of June 5, 1942, the strategic balance in the Pacific shifted irreversibly. Japan would never again mount a major offensive in the Central Pacific. The United States would never again fight outnumbered. The war would continue for 3 more years, brutal and unforgiving, but the outcome, uncertain before Midway, became inevitable after. The codebreakers in the basement at Pearl Harbor did not win the war. But they made it possible to win. They broke the code that the enemy believed was unbreakable. They deciphered the messages that revealed the enemy's plan. They told Admiral Nimitz where the Japanese fleet would be, and Nimitz sent his carriers to meet them. The rest was execution. The dive bombers, the torpedoes, the burning flight decks, the sinking carriers, all of it flowed from that initial act of cryptanalysis. The battle was won in the dungeon before it was fought in the air. The legacy of the Midway code breaking extends into the present day through the institutions and practices it established. The National Security Agency, created in 1952, traces its lineage directly to the Navy's wartime cryptanalytic units, including Station HYPO. The methods developed by Rochefort and his team, the integration of signals intelligence with operational planning, the emphasis on delivering timely intelligence to commanders in the field, all became foundational principles of modern intelligence work. The tension between centralized control and field autonomy persists in intelligence organizations worldwide. The lesson of Midway, that officers closest to the problem are often best positioned to solve it, remains relevant but is still contested by institutional hierarchies that prioritize control over results. Rochefort's fate serves as both inspiration and warning to intelligence professionals who must navigate the space between duty to mission and duty to chain of command. If this story gave you a new way to see the Pacific War, like, share, and subscribe, and tell us which moment surprised you most. We'll return next week with another chapter in the war that changed the world.